We have a great range of speakers today. To start with, we've got a joint presentation, which will be with Juliet Vickery, Professor Juliet Vickery, who's the Chief Executive of the British Trust for Ornithology, and also Dr. James Pearce-Higgins, who's the Director of Science at the British Trust for Ornithology. So we're thrilled to have them both with us. We'll be introducing our other speakers after our first talk, but welcome to all our speakers. And with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to James and Juliet for the first part of today's webinar. James and Juliet, a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Andy, and hello everyone. Great to be here, and particularly to be here as a bit of a double act from the British Trust for Ornithology. So because we're a double act, James is going to be the slide sharer, and I'll do a kind of Chris Whitty and ask him for the next slide when it's time for the next slide, and then pass to him halfway through the talk. Of course, we're here to talk about climate change. For James and I, that will focus mainly on birds, because clearly that's the area from which we both come, from the British Trust for Ornithology. And what I want to do is say a little bit more to start with, in context, really, to put climate change in the context of what else is happening in our natural world around us. Next slide, please, James. So we are hugely lucky in the UK to have a huge wealth of data and information about the state of our natural world, derived from numerous research institutes and also from many NGOs. And the epitome of that really is the State of Nature report, which comes out every 3 years and really documents how our world is faring over time. So just to put climate change really sort of into context of what's generally going on. Next slide, please, James. This kind of, at first glance, rather complicated slide tells a kind of rather simple and slightly depressing story. So if you just focus on the graph itself, this is just an index of change. It tells you how a whole range of different species from a whole range of different taxonomic groups, birds, insects, mammals, are faring. The solid dark line bumps around from year to year. That's annual changes, changes in weather patterns, perhaps from one year to the next. But that smooth blue line with a pale white line in the middle of it tells you the generic trend. What's happening overall? What's the big picture? And you can see that it's basically heading downwards, in this case, since the 1970s. Now, you'll have all heard the term biodiversity crisis, and this trend may look to you actually not that alarming. And what you need to remember is that that trend captures species that are both increasing and decreasing. So it's a composite measure of what's going on. And if you just look at the two bar charts to the right of that graph, there you've got a line divided into blue and green boxes. If you look at the long-term trend, so that's 1970 to 2016. In the green, you see species that are actually doing rather well, and in blue, species that are not doing so well. And the take-home message is that about 40% of species have shown a strong or moderate decline since 1970, and only about 26% have shown a strong or moderate increase. So as well as understanding the pattern of what's going on in our natural world in the UK, this work also looks to try and understand what are the drivers, what are the causes of this generic deterioration, if you like, in the abundance of species around us. Next slide, please, James. Again, this is a complicated slide at first glance, but just look at the left-hand two bars. If you could just click on for me, James, that will bring those two up. So, so what these bars show you is the extent of impact on a range of species of different sorts of drivers. Where the line is red, the impact is negative. Where the line is green, the impact is positive. And those two left-hand bars represent the impact of agriculture and the impact of climate. So really, all this, as I say, quite complicated graphic is telling you is the biggest driver of change in the UK's natural world is agricultural change, and climate change is the next biggest factor driving the differences that we're seeing. Next slide, please, James, just quickly. And again, click on. So this is showing you the same thing. This just shows you across insects, plants, and invertebrates. Intensive management of agricultural land and climate change are the top two factors having an impact on the species around us now. And if you click on once more for me, James, I think the factor is 20% of all the impact on species populations is down to agricultural management. So we just need to remember to see climate change in the context of other things that are going on and the dramatic impact that's having. And thanks, James. And the reason it's so big, of course, is because so much of our land is indeed managed for agriculture. 75% of the UK's land is under agricultural production. And you see that knock-on effect on that graph on the right-hand side with farmland birds declining to a hugely greater extent than any other, if you like, groups of birds that you see. It's seabirds or woodland birds or water and wetland birds. So that indicator, that farmland bird index that derives from that number tells us things are going badly wrong in our agricultural land. The causes of that in more detail, if you click on James, are complex, interacting. They work in agricultural land that stretches from pasture to arable. It impacts on ground nesters like the lapwing and on seed eaters like the yellowhammer. A whole range of changes that have impacted on birds' ability to survive and to breed in our landscapes. And through really decades of research, scientists have unwrapped and unraveled the cause of the decline. What exactly is the problem? For example, for a bird like a yellowhammer, we know that the loss of stubbles in winter essentially removes what's equivalent to a giant bird table in our agricultural landscape. They have very little food over winter, and that drives problems for survival. And by understanding the problems and then looking at ways to manage land within our agricultural landscapes, we can introduce ways to kind of provide a lifeline for these birds. And that's exactly what's happened through many agri-environment schemes. And if you click on, James, to the last slide of my group, this again just shows you the farmland bird index. How well are a group of about 20 birds doing? The blue line is what's actually happening, so not great, despite lots of knowledge about how to try and stem this decline. The red dotted line, however, is essentially expert guess about what would have happened in the absence of agri-environment scheme measured based on science. So although it doesn't look great, we know it would have looked much worse without those agri-environment scheme measures. The take-home message really is that agriculture has a massive impact. Climate change is kind of next on the list, but with science, we can understand the problem, develop solutions to that problem and start to implement them. So it does give us hope in the same way that James will show you for climate change, but it's a more complicated problem and perhaps a bigger challenge. So over to you, James.
Thanks very much, Juliet, and still good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be talking to you this morning. You probably don't need me to introduce the topic of climate change very much. It's in our news increasingly, and this is the context. This graph was published at the end of last year and shows surface temperature across the world for the last 140 years or so. And the darker the color for individual years, darker the red shows that those are the warmest years, and the dark blue highlights the coldest years. You can see there's a strong warming trend of over a degrees warming since that kind of pre-industrialized level, and particularly rapid warming since the 80s, paused a bit during the 2000s, but then has increased again more rapidly. And last year was the equal warmest on record, tied with 2016. So that's globally where we are. And if we look at the equivalent data produced by the Met Office, I think from the for the UK, this is from the State of Nature report, you can see a similar warming trend. Here in particular, strong warming since the 80s, which we have seen. But it's hard for us, as humans, to kind of appreciate and see these patterns changing. Days like today and this week are very hot. Other days will be colder and wetter. And I think within all of that, it's very hard for us to actually track the long-term data, the long-term trends, unless we're actively measuring it. And I think that partly drives some of the skepticism that we see around us. But yet, actually, by looking at biodiversity and by looking at species, we can see the fingerprints of climate change all over the changes in the natural world. And I want to draw your attention to some of those today. So firstly, I want to look at changes in the timing of biological events, changes in phenology, changes in when birds are breeding and when migrants are arriving. And our knowledge of this goes right back to the Bible times, to the Old Testament. Jeremiah is quoted here, pointing out that the predictability of the arrival of storks, of turtle doves, of swallows and cranes in terms of their summer migration through the land of Israel, And yet contrasting that with people's sort of lack of knowledge of the law. I won't draw any sort of analogies to that and maybe our understanding of kind of environmental sustainability in the Bible, but I'm sure that's something that will come out a bit later on during the course of this discussion. And we see from our data that in response to warming trends, the timing of bird nesting here shown from BTO Nest Record Scheme data has become much earlier over the last 50 years or so. So swallows now are nesting on average about a week and a half earlier than they did during the 1960s. And looking at changes in the timing of arrival of some of our long distance migrants like the swallow, these are similarly much earlier than they used to. So what's plotted on this graph is the association between the arrival of birds during the 1960s, where that number reflects the numbers of days since the beginning of January. So just to help you kind of find your bearings on that, April is roughly sort of days 90 to 120. So most of our migrants, long distance migrants, arrive in April. And then correlating that with their arrival times during the 2000s. If there had been no change in arrival time during that period, everything would be clustered on that red line. None of those species are, they're all below the line, which shows that they are on average arriving, again, 5 to 10 days earlier than they would have been previously. Something like the sand martin there, as you can see, as now arriving over 2 weeks earlier than it used to. And this is a widespread phenomena across different taxonomic groups. Climate change is changing the seasons. It's also changing where species are found. It's changing the distributions of species. Those of you who are bird watchers, particularly in southern England, will probably be used now to seeing little egrets. They're a species that certainly I never saw as a child, and I still get excited about seeing as they've colonized the UK. But there's lots of other examples. Here, there's a small skipper, which in the 60s was really at its northern limits in Yorkshire. If I fast forward to the 90s, it had shifted about 70 kilometers northwards. And then by the 2000s, as shown by the red and the yellow dots, which denote different sort of qualities of data, it was up to the Scottish borders. And lots of other species groups have shown the same pattern. And there's been quite a lot of work analysing these long-term data, which are collected by extensive networks of volunteers. People are just submitting records of things that they've seen and documenting these range changes. So these rather complicated graphs really just show the average shift northwards for these different species groups for that early period from the 60s to the 80s at the top, and that later period from sort of the 80s, 90s to the 2000s at the bottom. And where that bar is above the line, above the horizontal line, that indicates that there has been a significant northwards shift, which is what the asterisk denotes statistical significance. And the three different coloured bars identify different ways in which the data are kind of subdivided to focus on maybe the highest quality data in the red bars, for example. But the take-home message from this is that across a wide range of taxa, whether you're looking at birds or butterflies or grasshoppers or woodlice, there's evidence of those northwards shifts. And particularly for some of the flying groups, those like the hoverflies, butterflies, dragonflies, moths, that evidence is really strong. So we're seeing changes in the timing of biological events. We're seeing changes in the distribution of species. And thirdly, we're seeing changes in ecological communities. And particularly that's been measured by a measure of the composition of particular communities, whether birds or butterflies, as shown in this map here, dividing species up into those that are associated with warmer temperatures or cold temperatures, and using that to come up with an index for each location of how kind of warm associated a particular bird community is. And that measure has changed through time. And the upward arrows right across the board, particularly in Scandinavia, show that these communities across both birds and butterflies are increasingly dominated by warmer associated species. So, and I'm sure you've probably seen this in your gardens or in the countryside around you, you are seeing perhaps more species that are once expanding northwards and are more abundant, species that are associated with kind of southern Britain and warmer temperatures, and maybe fewer species associated with the north and cooler temperatures. But just to hark back to Juliet's introduction, that doesn't mean that these signals are dominating. And I just want to remind you of that work on the decline in farmland birds, as shown by the black line. Again, this is a measure of that farmland bird index that Juliet was talking about. That decline in farmland birds, as Juliet said, is attributed to changes in agricultural intensification, as shown by the grey line. That's what we would expect the farmland bird decline to be, based on changes in agricultural intensification. If we were to look at what we'd have expected farmland bird populations to have done in response to climate change, it's that dotted line, which is largely horizontal. And you see there absolutely doesn't explain those changes in farmland birds. And indeed, it's actually slightly positive. And so although we often talk about climate changes as being damaging and negative, we do find actually for many of our particularly common and widespread bird species in the UK, many of those are slightly more abundant than they would have been because of warmer temperatures. Particularly, we're getting fewer severe winters, which tend to knock those populations back, populations of species like goldcrests, wrens, long-tailed tits, and so on. So many of our common and widespread resident bird species are actually becoming more common and more abundant as a result of climate change. And it's the species which are perhaps associated with more northern and cooler climates, our seabirds, like the kittiwakes here, our upland species, some of our long-distance migrants, which we think are being more negatively impacted by climate change. So particularly what we see in our seas, where perhaps there's some of the strongest evidence, is warmer temperatures disrupting the food chain, affecting food resources, the availability of fish around our seabird colonies, and affecting the long-term breeding success and populations of these kittiwakes. We're currently in the final year of what's been a large-scale seabird census over the last few years, and it'll be very interesting to see what the results of that show. That's what we've seen so far. And now I want to look and do it into the future. This graph produced by the Met Office shows that kind of observed temperature trend for the UK in black, and overlays that against green predictions, which are in the absence of kind of increases in greenhouse gases, so suggest what warming would have occurred, or i.e. not very much, if there hadn't been any sort of anthropogenic climate change. And in red, the predicted consequences of increases in greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see those observed data are slap bang in the middle of what we would expect from that anthropogenic warming. And that gives us an idea of what the future may look like if we continue to pump out our greenhouse gas emissions. So what does that mean for birds? What we can do is take our data on the abundance and distribution of species, correlate that with measures of the climate, and then see where we would expect species to occur and how common we would expect them to be under future climates. And this slide shows this for curlew, one of our declining species. It's got a northern and westerly distribution. Numbers have declined in the UK over the last 25 years or so by about 50%, largely down to increased rates of predation, habitat changes, but also there is a fingerprint of climate change within that. And that climate change signal is likely to increase. And you can see it's projected to result in northwards contractions of that species. And in that graph on the bottom right, projected declines under low, medium, and high climate change scenarios of up to 50% by 2080, with the red bar being the 20 being the high climate change scenario. So, and it's particularly our species of conservation concern, those already threatened by other factors which we think are most vulnerable to climate change impacts. So the negative impacts of climate change shown in orange and red here are most apparent across red-list species on the right-hand map. Even if you look across all bird species, because of what I said around the sort of positive effects of warmer temperatures, we actually see many are likely to expand their distribution and populations within the UK. Hence the map on the left is actually largely blue. And as I said, it's particularly some of our seabirds, and across all species, our northern and cold associated upland species, which are most vulnerable to climate change. This graph summarizes data across a range of taxa and shows that across most habitats for habitat specialists, about a third of species, as shown in red and orange, are at risk of negative climate change impacts. About a third are potentially likely to benefit from climate change. But in the uplands, that balance is very much skewed, and the vast majority of species are most vulnerable. So what does this mean for the future in terms of our responses to climate change? And I just want to look at this in the last couple of minutes with respect to one of those upland birds, the golden plover. Here is a fantastic golden plover chick, possibly one of the cutest animals that we've got in this country. They feed on crane flies and other insects when they hatch in May and June, and the abundance of those crane flies in particular is a key driver of their breeding success. The crane flies have an annual life cycle. They lay their eggs in the surface of the peat, which hatch in July, and they live as almost microscopic larvae in July and August, but they need it to be wet. If the peat dries out, for example, if you get a hot, dry summer, as shown in that graph at the top there, then most of the crane fly larvae will die, and you get very few crane fly emerging the next spring to feed on the golden plovers. Hence, there's that strong negative correlation between crane fly abundance and temperature of the previous August. And if we look at changes in golden plover populations in the Peak District from one year to the next in relation to August temperature too, we see that same pattern. So if there's few crane flies around in the golden plover breeding season, that means there's fewer food for the chicks, fewer chicks survive, and the population tends to decline. Now that all sounds very negative, but there are things we can do about it. Conservation organisations are restoring our peatlands, and this strong relationship between peatland moisture and crane fly abundance is key to that. So by restoring peatlands, raising water levels, we can actually weaken the link between temperature and crane fly abundance by raising those water levels. So what that means is in the absence of any management, we might expect that Peak District population of the golden plovers to decline to extinction by the end of this century. But with proactive management, we can help that population cope with at least 2.5 degrees warming. And organisations like RSPB, the National Trust and so on have done a lot of work on those peatland areas to restore them to good quality, as you can see in this slide here. So these pools here, for example, are the result of active management and raising the water levels, which will make it more resilient to climate change. And I'm sure there's a point there that Mike will pick up in the next presentation. So just to conclude, I hope I've shown you that by looking at nature, that helps us see the impacts of climate change. And we see those fingerprints in a number of different ways. Climate change will result in winners and losers. Many of our common and widespread generalist species will probably do better in response to climate change. They're the most adaptable species. But it's the habitat specialists, our upland species and our seabirds, which are perhaps most threatened in the UK. But by doing research into these issues and informing conservation responses, we can increase the resilience of those populations to climate change. So although there's a lot of understandable negativity and concerns around climate change, I hope I've given you some seeds of hope there, that hope that actually there's something that we can do. If you're interested and able to get involved with counting birds or butterflies, then you can contribute to some of the long-term monitoring schemes that have underpinned the data that I've presented today, and actually make a difference in terms of providing that evidence that helps us have that understanding of the climate change impacts, whether it's doing something like the garden birdwatch in the BTO's garden birdwatch to record birds in your gardens, looking at the butterfly monitoring scheme on Butterfly Conservation's website, and a whole range of other things depending on your expertise. Support conservation organisations as well, like a Rocha. There's a lot, I hope I've shown you, that conservation organisations can do to help the natural world cope with climate change. But also, finally, from a Christian perspective, the future can look scary, but we all obviously have hope in Jesus Christ as well. And I think we can all rest our cares on his shoulders. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
James, that was fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing that, and Juliet as well, much appreciated. I'm sorry the signal's not as strong as we'd like it to be from Northern Ireland, so if I cut in and out slightly, my apologies. So at that point, we're going to go straight over to Dr. Mike Moorcroft, who's the Principal Specialist on Climate Change for the government organisation Natural England. Mike, we're thrilled to have you here, and we'll go straight over to you for the next session. Though I would just add in, for those of you who've recently arrived and those who would like a reminder, do put questions to the speakers in the chat function at the bottom. You'll find the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Please do click on that. And if you've got anything you'd like to ask, there will be an opportunity at the end for Q&A, and I'm sure the speakers will be delighted to answer some of your more challenging questions. With that, Mike, straight over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andy. And it's good to be with you. I should also apologize that I'm going to have to leave fairly promptly after my talk. So if you do have questions specifically for me, do put them in the chat as we go along. And if I'm quick, I might just have a chance to answer one before I go. If not, we can get back to you later. So I will share my screen. Just give me one moment. Right, I'm hoping we can see that. Hang on, here we go. Can someone confirm they can see the right screen there?
Yes,
it's
Mike,
clear, yeah.
Excellent, right, okay. So I was asked to talk about nature-based solutions for climate change, adaptation and mitigation. And the phrase nature-based solutions is actually one that's really come up the agenda in a big way in the last few years. And I'll unpack a little bit more about what that means as we go along, actually. But I'd first wanted just to, I suppose, reinforce and pick up some of the things that James has just been talking about. So in Natural England, we have a wide range of different roles, one of which is around managing national nature reserves. We do a lot of other stuff as well, but our own national nature reserves are sites where we do the management, we know what's going on. And we asked our reserve managers to assess what the risks of climate change were across the different range of habitats and the features, the species, the habitats that they were created for. And the little graph here you can see sort of gives a breakdown of the risk, whether it was high, medium or low risk that the different types of national nature reserves were experiencing. Red's high, green's low, traffic light system. And you can see across almost all habitats, our national nature reserves are facing either medium or high risks. There are some habitats that are okay, but in general, there is quite a high risk to them. And we are starting to develop adaptation strategies to reduce those risks. So for example, on the left, you can see Cowthorpe Broad, which is a freshwater system, a freshwater lake really, but close to the sea and at risk from increasing intrusion of salt water into it. Also in that part of the country in East Anglia, potential risk from dry summers from climate change. So we have a little wind-powered pump that can keep the water level up, which can hopefully build the resilience and reduce the risks. So as James was saying, there are things we can do sometimes to actually build the resilience of the natural environment. We also find, and I'm not going to elaborate it more today, but we've done a lot of work to look at how actually the risks are bigger in small, fragmented little patches of habitat. And if we can create bigger habitat in better condition, then it's often going to be more resilient to climate change and a better ongoing home for the species that live there. It's not the whole answer, but it certainly reduces some of the risks. But I was asked today to particularly talk about nature-based solutions. And there is a widely accepted definition of that, which comes from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, big international body that brings together conservation initiatives. And the IUCN defines nature-based solutions as actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. Now that's quite a mouthful, and they did very carefully select each of those words. But the really key things I'd like to highlight, that I think is at the heart of the idea of a nature-based solution, is that we're addressing problems. You know, a solution, it has to be a solution to a problem. So in the case of the things I work on, that's climate change. But it's doing it in a way that benefits both people and biodiversity. So we're looking for the win-win solutions, if you like, the things that where we can start to address problems with biodiversity and climate in the same action. And you sometimes hear us described as having a climate emergency or climate crisis, and also a biodiversity one. So this is really about recognizing that actually in some respects, they're two sides of the same coin, and the nature-based solution is looking to address the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis at the same time in a joined up way. So what does that mean in practice? Well, there's two aspects really to what we do with climate change. One's what we call mitigation, which in this context is tackling the causes of climate change, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this doesn't have to be a nature-based solution. I mean, an electric car is in some ways, well, in many ways, a very good mitigation measure for climate change. It reduces emissions. It's not a nature-based one, I'd have to say, but it's an important part of the picture. But the natural environment and the farmed environment are important sources of emissions of greenhouse gases, so we can try and tackle those. But we can also take carbon out of the atmosphere, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, but trees is often what people think about. As a tree grows, it takes carbon out of the atmosphere or sequesters it. So that's if you like, the emissions side of it, the greenhouse gas side. But some climate change is inevitable. In fact, as that graph that James put up shows, you know, climate change is here and now. It's not a future problem. It's here, and you've only got to listen to the news to know that in some parts of the world, it's even a bigger problem than it is for us. So, you know, floods, fires, droughts. So we also need to adapt to climate change. We need to deal with the effects. We need to reduce vulnerability and adjust to some changes that we can't stop, or at least not anytime soon. And there is a nature-based strand that runs through both of these approaches, mitigation and adaptation. I won't dwell on this, but I wanted to look first at the idea of carbon in natural systems. And it's fresh in my mind because we recently published a big scientific report on that. Unlike the BTO, we don't tend to go for big fancy graphics, but it's packed full of information if you want to go into the more of the scientific approach. But we do know that some habitats actually store a lot of carbon. Some take it up very effectively, but also, sadly, some are releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so what this translates into as a nature-based solution for climate change mitigation is a set of things. And this is just a sort of a taster, I guess, but these are some of them, the ones that are most often talked about. First of all, peatland restoration. Peat builds up very, very slowly from dead plants over millennia, literally thousands of years. And there's a vast amount of carbon that's stored in peat. Unfortunately, a lot of our peatlands in this country are in very poor state. They've been extracted for horticulture, for burning, more in the past, but also for turning into agriculture and forestry. So and all of those actions lead to a release of carbon dioxide. And you can see a slightly sorry looking peatland in the top left picture here. That's Bolton Fell Moss in Cumbria a few years ago that was extracted for horticultural peat. But it can be restored, and it's a place we have been restoring very successfully in recent years, and you can reduce the emissions. So restoring peatland is a really top priority as a nature-based solution, because not only does restoring it usually by building up the water table, but in the same way as with James's illustration, but also sometimes by actually having to create a new vegetation cover with things like sphagnum moss on top of it. If you do that, you stop the carbon emissions, but it's also great for species. The next one, and it's the one that people often think about, is woodland creation. Planting trees, although in some cases trees can grow back naturally. As they grow, they store carbon. And some of that can go for forestry. Nice sustainable timber products, very good. But also pure conservation. A species-rich, biodiverse native woodland can store a lot of carbon. You don't even have to plant it sometimes. It will grow back naturally given a chance, at least if you're very close to an existing woodland. And then there's what happens on the coast. Salt marsh is another habitat that stores a lot of carbon, but we've been losing it as the sea level has risen. And it tends to get squeezed between hard flood defences, flood walls, and the sea. So we can restore salt marsh, and that's happening. And similarly, a bit further out, seagrass meadows, another good way of locking up carbon, but in a poor state. And we're looking to restore those and starting to do that. And it's not just in the pristine natural environments, there's also within the farmed environment. So better managing soil, putting more organic matter back to build the organic matter of the soil, hold water better. It's good for nature, supports more soil biodiversity, but also good for carbon. And also within the wider sort of landscape, things like trees, standing individual trees, hedgerows, and little patches of species-rich grassland, perhaps little buffer strips by the edge of fields can all play a role as well. But moving on, it's not just about the carbon, it's also about reducing risks to people as well as to nature. And some of the risks we face from more extreme flood events that come with climate change can be reduced by actually putting our watercourses or our coastlines back into a more natural state. We've often in the past tried to take water off the land as quick as we possibly can, which is good if you're upstream and you're trying to farm a crop on it, but if you're downstream, it's not what you want. So actually putting some of the wiggles back into the streams and rivers, like the picture at the top left, slows up the water flow, allows it to spread out, and let's flood the places where we can safely flood them, the water meadows and the wetlands rather than people's homes. So the natural environment can be a sort of source, a store of water in the environment. And then we can do a similar thing at the coast, and that's an example down the bottom left of where actually we've taken out flood defences, the hard concrete flood defences, to create wet spaces where the sea can naturally come in, won't do harm to people, but can do a lot of good in creating new habitat. And even in the city, more green space, more shade trees can create a nice cool environment, but it can also store water, take the water away into places where it drains away safely. It's the Queen Elizabeth Country Park at the top there, which is developed in the course of the 2012 Olympics and has left a good lasting legacy of urban green space. And I think, often if you're not careful, local authorities can default to a rather sort of municipal, sort of boring flat grass. But you can have a wildflower meadow or a little woodland, a wetland, with so much more for nature. So I'm coming towards the end now, just thinking what this means to all of us. What can we do? And I just want my local church, St Lawrence's in Hungerford, little market town in West Berkshire, on the border with Wiltshire. We've started to do a lot more than we've ever done in the past. So we've got a wildflower meadow in our churchyard now. We've also planted some trees there, and we've partnered with the local community in planting trees, which is the picture on the bottom right there. So there's things we can do, and I'll just give a quick shout out to the Eco Church initiative, which Rocha has led on and manages, and I do commend that to you as a way of helping you to think through what you could do. Whoops. So my final thoughts then, what can I do? What can you do for nature-based solutions? Well, some of it for most of us is probably a little ambitious. Most of us own peatlands we can restore, or a few hundred hectares we could plant with trees, but some people do. And if you work in farming or land management, there is an opportunity perhaps to create and restore habitats if you can, and government support for that is changing, and I think there will be new opportunities. But if, like most of us, you're not in that space, you can support those charities perhaps that do that kind of work. You can plant a tree, in your garden or locally. Try and make sure it's the right one in the right place, not on peatlands for a start. And you can engage with your local council. There's often a real willingness there to talk to people and the wider community about what we can do. I'd also suggest we can start to talk more about climate and nature. And finally, and this is just a thought I throw out, can we actually adopt a nature-based approach to the way we live and the way we do our work, where we're looking for those sort of solutions that are good for nature and good for us, not as something new or different or special, but just part of the way we live as human beings on this earth. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Mike, thank you. That was fantastic. I'm just going to go to the chat function because I believe we had a question there. My question for you was, is there a general term that covers both the climate and biodiversity crisis?
No. People do tend to use both. I mean, yeah, you could talk about an environment emergency. I think though, then that can become, I think it is quite helpful to use both terms, but to think of them as linked problems. That's my personal view anyway.
Thanks, Mike. And I know a couple of people are wanting to know more about what your church is doing in terms of eco-church activities.
Mine? Well, I say I gave a couple of examples. The tree planting's been the most exciting thing. And our vicar, who's not really done that in the past, has really got very excited and has been using it as a real opportunity to reach out to the local community. But we've also done a lot of things around the way we use products within the church for catering and when you're allowed to, and that kind of thing, and looking at our heating. It's not easy, the heating side of things, I have to say, in an old building, but on the nature side, we live in a nice rural area. We've got some opportunities there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And you've also got a warm invitation to a church in Eastbury to come and share your knowledge. But
yeah, not far away.
We'll provide a link for that. There's a question here on what's more important, mitigation or adaptation, Mike, and I'm aware of the time, so we'll ask you a couple more questions and let you go.
I don't think we should get into the either or. I mean, both are important, and you know, globally, if you talk to developing countries, and I should say some of my work's with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but you know, there are some incredibly vulnerable people in places like Bangladesh to rising sea level, for example. So, you know, even if we turned off all the CO2 emissions tomorrow, there's a lot of climate change and sea level rise still locked in. So we can't trade one off against the other. We have to do both. I mean, a lot of in the long run, obviously, it is the emission reductions that's going to slow and stop the problem. But we can't ignore adaptation, but equally we can't use adaptation as an excuse for not doing the emission reductions. It has to be both.
Thanks, Mike. And I know as you've got to go off to an interview, I'm going to just do one more question for you, and that is there a place for permaculture and regenerative approaches to farming in the context of climate and nature, in your mind? Should that form part of the solution here?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I'm not an expert on permaculture per se, but you know, there's a whole family of different approaches within the general framework of regenerative agriculture, and I definitely think it is. I think, you know, getting the right farming system in the right place and working with farmers, helping them to do that, I think is really important. And I think there's something about empowering, you know, it's not about people like me coming in and telling them what to do. Usually it's a matter of, you know, supporting them and helping them to make good informed decisions in their local circumstance. But yeah, I think both from an emissions adaptation point of view, definitely.
Thanks, Mike. Mike, we're going to let you go. I know there are a number of other questions and comments in there, which we will pick up and share with you, but also we'll pick up with the other speakers at the end in the question and answer. But just to say, on behalf of Rocha and everybody here, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real privilege having you. And we'll no doubt cross paths again in a not too distant future, but we must let you go and get on with the interviews you've got to do. So I appreciate that you've made time. Thank you very much, Mike.
Okay, right. Thanks. It's been good to be with you.
So if your questions weren't answered there, because I know a number of questions are coming in thick and fast, then do please be aware that we'll do our best to pick those up in the Q&A session at the end. I know Andy Atkins has put a comment in there onto the link to time is now. I'll let him elaborate on that as he comes to speak shortly. So with no further ado, I want to introduce Andy Atkins, my learned colleague, Chief Executive of Rocha UK, and former Executive Director of Friends of the Earth. I also played a significant role in the Make Poverty History campaign with Tier Funds when he was working there within the leadership team. Andy, warm welcome. Over to you to have a look at the policy response.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to discussing this much further with you all after this, but I'll keep to time, and I've told Andy to cut me off whatever happens after 15 minutes to allow maximum time for questions. Let me just start by restating and stating very firmly the significance of nature-based solutions for addressing climate change. You've heard all about what they are, you've heard about the impact of climate and nature and so on, but now we're really talking about what difference could they make to addressing climate change and what are governments doing about it. So recent research suggests that nature-based solutions could provide around 30% of the cost-effective mitigation that is needed by 2030 to stabilize global warming beneath 2 degrees C. 30%. That's a lot. So the world clearly does need to adopt nature-based solutions if we want to bring climate change under control. And the forthcoming COP26 climate negotiations, therefore, are a critical and very timely opportunity to accelerate the adoption of nature-based solutions by governments, by countries, by civil society as well. So as we prepare for COP26, therefore, we need to understand what governments are or are not actually doing about this. What are they intending to do? So let me turn to what the UK government has said. The UK government is hosting COP26. It's the chair of it, has a huge influence of what could potentially happen. And it's set out 4 big goals for COP26. I won't read them all for time, but one of them is very specifically adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. Obviously, clearly in the realm of nature-based solutions. But when you dig beneath the surface of the other goals, in fact, they all have implications for nature-based solutions. So, for example, one of the goals is to secure global net zero. But one of the sub-bullets for that is curtail deforestation. So you see that nature-based solutions are potentially there under all 4 headlines, in fact, all 4 goals that this government has, our government has for COP. So there's no doubt that negotiations represent a major opportunity towards habitat restoration, improved land management, and so on. But there is a very significant but. There are risks, and I need to point to 2 or 3 risks that we need to be aware of before we get too excited. The biggest danger, in my view, to climate change as well as nature loss, actually, is what I would call diversion or distraction, that some politicians and businesses who were always reluctant to bite the bullet and get our economy off fossil fuel will promote nature-based solutions as the magic bullet in order to delay or avoid action they do not wish to take on fossil fuel and other things. I'm sorry to sound, if that sounds cynical, but it's happened over and over again. I can name you many other issues which have been put forward of this is the solution, and everybody's gone off down that road and actually failed to do the one most important thing we need to do and get off fossil fuel fast. So we have to be very clear. We do need nature-based solutions. We must have them, but they cannot be at the expense of getting off fossil fuel very fast. Now, the second risk is about greenwash. Frankly, that enormous sums of money, including corporate and government communications budgets, will be spent on promoting projects that will actually make very little difference or could even do harm if they aren't done right. There's a huge temptation for business and government to do a little bit of nature and pretend it's going to make a very big difference when actually it could do harm or it could be a distraction. So we need to watch the scale at which this is done, and we also need to watch how it's done. That brings me to the third risk, the risk to nature itself if it is not done well, particularly if it's not done in a way that takes into account wider nature and its needs. So according to the Royal Society, for example, 45% of expected tree planting in the UK over the next decade will be in commercial conifer systems, though not all necessarily in order to combat climate change. But these are very poor for nature, as many of you will know as nature buffs. They're very, very sterile environments. And also, they often only lock up carbon dioxide for a very short time. So there's a question about how useful they actually are for combating climate change anyway. So if forestation is going to take place on what would naturally be grassland or wetland, then it's potentially destroying precious habitat. So reforesting Britain, for example, to help with climate change must be done with the right mix of species in the right places if it's not to be actually damaging. So those are the risks, but we don't believe as a Rocha, we should let the risk get in the way of going fast forward on this. We have to go fast forward, but we have to avoid the risks as we go. So having established the need and the opportunity and the risk, what's the current state of play? What are governments actually thinking and doing on this? And the best lens on that is to look at, and it's a techie term, to look at the national what do they call them, NDCs, which are the voluntary contributions that governments are making, which they are taking to COP, saying this is what we're going to do. Sorry, the nationally determined contributions, a bit of a mouthful. What it means is, what is their plan? What is the plan they're taking to COP, saying how much carbon they're going to cut and how they're going to do it? So if you look at those, and a very recent study only came out this month, looks at the NDCs that have been produced so far. Only 55 have been produced. That's another 117 still to come before we get to November. So it's only looking at about a third of what should be coming by November. But that gives you an idea. On the bright side, even if only a third have been done, it means there's everything to play for in those countries that have not yet produced their NDC to make sure that nature-based solutions are in there and they're going to be done well. But if you look at the 55 that have been done so far, what the study says is that there's an increase of 43 to 50 compared to the previous NDCs of those that are including nature-based solutions. 42 in the context of adaptation plans, and Mike explained the difference in adaptation and mitigation, and 36 in the context of both mitigation and adaptation. Okay, so that reflects a positive trend compared to the previous NDCs, the one that was done 5 years ago for Paris. But really importantly, out of the 44 NDCs so far that include nature-based solutions for mitigation, only 24, call it 2/3, have quantified these numerical targets. And that's a real issue. People are using the words, but they're not saying what they're actually going to try to achieve. Lastly, I'm picking out just a few points here from that analysis, whereas 8 countries are now talking about nature-based solutions that, sorry, 9 countries are now talking about nature-based solutions that were not talking about it in their previous one. 8 have actually stopped talking about it. So what I suspect is going on is you're starting to see a backlash as people in those countries, particularly large landowners, start realizing what the implications could be for them if their country goes down the nature-based solution route. So we have to watch very carefully the net result. So the net result so far of countries talking about NDCs is a net increase in 1 since 5 years ago of those that have been looked at so far. So we really have to watch this. So that leads me on to what is the British government itself doing as a host of COP. Now, here I want to look at the national budget. There's another way of looking at what are governments intending to do as opposed to what are they saying. Our government's got some great rhetoric. It said some really good things. It's signed up to the global leaders pledge recently on restoring nature. Wonderful language. But look at the last budget, and what you see is this. Some good stuff, but it has to be held relative to other things that are going on. Last budget in March, the government signed up to a 640 million Nature for Climate Fund. That's excellent. To restore 35,000 hectares of peatland and to plant 30,000 hectares of trees in England by 2025. Sounds good, but actually that's way, way short of the target that the government set out actually in its manifesto for election, which was to plant 30,000 hectares every year. they've got a national climate fund. That's good, but it's way too small to fund all the tree planting and peat restoration costs that they say they want. There's good news in there of a 25 million nature recovery network in England, which is working with business and local communities. Rocha itself is linked to that, wanting to make a contribution. It brings together all players. That's an excellent idea. We support it. But that is chicken feed compared to, for example, the money that the government is spending on a new road building program. It's committed 27 billion to a new road building program, which will probably be extremely damaging for nature. So whilst there are steps forward on what the government is proposing to do on nature, frankly, it is knocked into a cocked hat by what the government is intended to spend on programs and projects that would actually be damaging still to environment. So we have to keep this in perspective. Good news, but we cannot take our eye off the things that are still being done to damage the environment. So where does that lead us? What should we do? I think, as others have already said, the churches have a major role to play in this, both as members of civil society, but actually as individuals and members of organizations that have access to land. So we as a Rocha are working up a big new goal, which we would invite all of you to participate in, because you can do, to see 75,000 acres of Christian managed land being managed for nature and cutting carbon over the next 5 years. I'll come back to how you can be involved in that in a minute, but we think everybody needs to be engaged. But right now, the most important thing to do, which is why I put something in the chat earlier, is to actually join something called the Climate Sunday Initiative. The reason for that is that because nature-based solutions are so high on the COP agenda, now is the moment for all of civil society to say to the government, please will you go much further, much faster on this issue at COP, and please will you put Britain's own house in order before you do. And the Climate Sunday Initiative, which I happen to chair, but it's a coalition across all major denominations now, and many, many Christian charities, Tear Fund, Christian Aid, CAFOD, and so on, is calling on Christians and churches to do three things. Hold a Climate Sunday service, hold a service between now and COP in November, where you look at the theology and the science behind climate change, understand the issue from a Christian perspective. Secondly, make a commitment as a church to what you're going to practically do. It could be to go further in eco-church, just as Mike's church is doing. That's a normal thing to do. Many churches go, okay, we'll go further in eco-church. We'll promise to get to silver, let's say, by next year. And the last thing is to sign the Time Is Now Declaration, which is a call for all of civil society, and I'll put the text in the chat, to call on the government to go further, faster before COP. It would be fantastic if large numbers of Christians and churches would sign that to give a very strong witness as well as signal to the government that we want our land restored and we want to take a lead as Britain to help the rest of the world do the same for nature, for climate, for people. Thank you.
Andy, thank you very much. That was fantastic and really inspiring stuff. We're going to go and shift now onto the questions. Just bear with me a second while I switch documents. Hopefully you can still hear and see me. So what I'm going to do is, rather than taking the questions in sort of group order, I'm going to take them as they've come in and then ask Juliet, James and Andy to respond. And I'll direct the questions to one or more of the speakers. So Steve Adams asks, are farmers on board with climate and nature and taking the matter seriously? Can I ask Juliet if she'd be kind enough to respond to that from her perspective?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? Are they on board? And quite hard to gauge. I would say that we know from past experience that many farmers, of course, are completely on board and utterly cherish and steward their land for all these things, but they are driven by markets and market economies. And so it will be how the government structures incentives and payments that will govern how farmers have to manage their land, because, of course, for them, that's the business. And we've seen that drive intensification, and we've seen it also help in restoring.
Juliet, thank you. Can I just check that people can still hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh, I think he's frozen. Okay. Yes, we can, but you froze for a minute, Andy.
Yeah, no, great. Apparently it's the joys of the weather in Northern Ireland which is causing some problems with the internet signals. So everywhere in the pub, people are having the same problem. Let's go back to the second question. If I do break out off, then we'll ask the tech support to pick up the questions. Question from Janet Wakeman. Given that most detriment to nature has occurred through agricultural practices and there needs to feed and house an ever-increasing population, how do we balance those needs and the need to protect, restore biodiversity? Andy, do you want to respond to that?
Yes. Now clearly, there does need to be a balance, but there are all sorts of potential solutions available that at the moment are not being deployed the way they could be. So I won't give you a very long list, but for example, we know that changing diets would be better for our health, but eating less meat as a general rule, that's not the same as you've got to become vegan or whatever. As a general rule, the rich Western world eats way too much meat. Were we to eat less, we would need less land for the food we produce. We would also be healthier for it. Then when it comes to this, so that's one thing about agriculture. There's also ways of doing agriculture. We heard from Juliet earlier about leaving margins around the fields and the impact the lack of that has had on things like yellowhammers and so on. You know, this is really easy to do. It's not, absolutely not rocket science. So doing our farming differently can make a very big difference to nature as well as to nature-based solutions and so on. And then on the housing front, you know, what we know is, yes, there will need to be houses, but in a situation in Britain where vast numbers of houses are empty most of the year because incredibly rich owners use them to make rent, I think there is an incredible justice issue we need to face. And the government is not facing it. It's just building more and more houses on green land rather than facing the huge availability already of houses that are not used. It's radical, but we have to start talking about where is the justice in that for people and where is the justice for nature as well. Now, that still won't avoid more houses need to be made, but we have to look at this in the round. The answer is not just to build, it's just to look at where are the houses already, who owns them, and why aren't they being used?
Andy, thank you. That's great. I'm going to open the next question up to the whole panel, and just feel free to wave at me if one of you'd like to answer. And that is a bit of a hybrid question. I saw the question of whether veganism is a solution to the climate crisis, but I'm going to open it up and say I'd kind of like to answer that in two halves. Firstly, is veganism an answer? And the second is whether vegetarianism is perhaps a better answer. Is one better than the other? So actually, I think it's quite good for us to grasp those two nettles. Anyone want to tackle that question from the panel? Juliet, go ahead. Yeah.
I can give one response to that, which is, I mean, it's part of all of the answers. There are many ways in which to tackle this. Personally, I feel that we will do probably more good by encouraging more people to simply eat a bit less meat than trying to encourage people to become vegetarian, which we know is, for whatever reason, a challenge for many. So my line is more around, I think there's more traction for me certainly in my circle of friends and colleagues in saying just eat a little bit less meat and think about buying food more locally than encouraging vegan or vegetarianism, because that meets with more resistance. I think it's a great thing to do and has a much bigger impact, but in the broad scale, more people doing a little bit, I think will have a bigger impact.
Juliet, thank you. Thank you very much. Andy, go ahead.
I think I would very much go along with that. When I was at Friends of the Earth, we launched the kind of the flexitarianism campaign. It went incredibly well. Influenced me and my family to eat less and better, basically. Also started buying better wine. Not actually something you want to advertise, but actually that has a big impact as well, believe it or not. Anyway, the other point there though is that actually we've got to take into account the needs of different parts of the world, and the fact that in some parts of the world it is much easier for them to effectively grow meat, than grains and so on. That will be the case. So I think it's very hard to take a completely blanket, thou shalt not eat meat, without actually harming people and their own livelihoods who really do not have much of a choice but to cultivate or, or farm meat. So I think we've got to be a bit more nuanced than just, here and recognize there's people behind this as well, who have livelihoods and so on. Now, I would like to see a lot less meat farming, but there will still be parts of the world, including in Britain, where it's the most logical and best thing to do. Andy, over to you. Can you hear us?
Yep, thanks, Andy. Yep. So the next question, James, if you would be kind enough to answer, and it's about farming and nature. And the question here is about how we approach the farming community. Should we be approaching the farming community to bring about stronger connectivity between climate and biodiversity? And if so, how should we do it? Because it may not be an easy thing for an individual to do. It may be better for like the BTO, an organizational approach. What's your thoughts and comments on that?
Yeah, thanks very much, Andy, and thanks for the question. I think, as Juliet has said, there are individuals who've got this and are doing things, off their own bat in terms of how they're managing their own farms to try and tackle some of these issues. But really, if we're going to achieve the scale of change that's required, this is something that has to be driven by agricultural policy, I think, and therefore delivered, with the associated kind of finances to support farming in the right way. And these discussions, I think, are happening in terms of looking at, as from the report that Mike was highlighting, looking at the kind of carbon impacts of different ways of managing the land. We as an organization do a lot of work around the biodiversity benefits of different agri-environment schemes, so ways in which farmers can manage their land more sympathetically for nature, and then from that working out which are the most useful, which are the most effective for different species, and then pulling all that information together to help to design a package of measures of interventions which deliver what's required and at the scale required. I'm pretty hopeful that with the appropriate use of existing data, the appropriate science that is put in place, we have the knowledge to be able to design and implement something that we want, that works for a wide range of different stakeholders, wide range of different benefits, wide range of different reasons. We can produce the food we want, we can kind of manage the land appropriately, but we need to, we then need to be able to invest in rolling that out at a sufficient scale to make a difference. And part of the problem that we've had, I think, to date, in that although we've got a lot of the answers, is that maybe the funding hasn't been there to support sufficient scale of the kind of more sympathetic management to make it easier for farmers to change their ways in a way that will deliver for climate and in a way that will deliver for nature. And that kind of ultimately is probably what's required to tackle this.
Any other thoughts from any of the other panelists on that question before we move on? Because it is a really big issue.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to link it to the question from Janet, which says, paying more for food at M&S and vegetables will simply sink the ecosystem in plastic. There's this thing called choice editing. Don't put bad stuff on the market. People can't buy it. And I think it becomes much, much easier for the progressive producers, whether that is of meat or whether that is of food that doesn't have to be put into plastic. If you simply say you can't do that. So we cannot escape in the end from regulation, from government saying we're going to take the bad stuff off the market. So, and that then makes it much easier for everybody, not just the consumer, to buy the good stuff. It makes it much easier for the good producers because they are not being undermined by people using bad practices. So I think we have to introduce this idea of, look, can we just stop doing the bad stuff as quickly as possible? We have to do that, because we need to do that as well as promote the good stuff. Back to what I was saying earlier, we can do all the nature-based solutions we want in the world, but if we keep on using fossil fuel, we will still fry. We've just got to get off fossil fuel. And it comes to the same with consumer products. Just stop doing the bad stuff, please. But normal people do not have a choice but to use much of that bad stuff because they can't afford to use the good stuff, or they don't understand the difference. And it's no point blaming them. We need governments to make it much easier for people to do the right stuff and much harder for them to do the wrong stuff, farmers included.
Andy, thank you very much. Julia, anything else you'd wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my comment about paying more for food was just recognizing that producing food in a much more environmentally sustainable way is likely to cost more. And that as consumers, our drive for cheap food has, of course, absolutely driven farmers to produce it. That's what we've done. And I think, you know, the reverse will be true. But of course, you know, then it's easy perhaps for someone like me, middle class, middle income, to say I'm happy to pay more for my food. It's obviously not so easy for many others. So I recognise by saying that there are also, you know, social justice aspects to it too. But I think we should recognise the cost of producing food sustainably. And there's lots of discussion now, more interesting discussion around you know, whether we should have all of our land managed in a sustainable, friendly way, or we put aside parts we manage very intensively and we leave other parts as wild habitat. There are lots of discussions happening about new ways of doing things. Remains to be seen how they pan out, both for economics and for the environment.
Juliet, thank you. So I think Colin Beale is still on the call. Colin, I was looking at your question, and I'm aware that some people may not understand the context. If you're on there, feel free to ask the question. Just briefly explain what NBS means for those who are on here who won't understand it. Colin, are you there?
I am here, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have Colin Beale on the call.
The question, I'm trying to find it again now, is about whether there is a risk that if the UK decides that the way we're going to pay for our climate emissions or something and solve these through a nature-based solution is exported to developing countries. Do we want to plant trees in the UK if we don't have enough space here? Do we plant trees in Tanzania or something like that? And if so, is there a broader risk that we're going to increase inequities by exporting the nature-based solutions to UK-based problems, or do we want to contain them locally?
Thank you. That question to any of the panelists who'd like to tackle that. Appreciate that, Colin. That's helpful. James.
Thanks, Colin. That is a really good question, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I suspect that risk does exist. We've seen those sorts of issues in the past of kind of in response to to well-meaning policies, say in the West. So I'm thinking for example around the EU and biofuels a few years ago, how that contributed to large-scale deforestation and palm oil plantations in Indonesia having significant negative impacts on biodiversity there. And so those issues are things that we definitely need to be aware of, and tree plantings are a really good case in point. Actually, you raise that. It's seen as a beneficial thing for the reasons that Mike talked about in terms of that climate change mitigation. But as Mike said, it's got to be the right trees in the right place. There's potential for real negative impacts in the UK if that's done badly. I mentioned curlews in my study, in my presentation. One of the key threats to their ongoing conservation status in the UK is tree planting on their breeding habitats. They are very sensitive not just to losing those habitats, but then the fragmentation effects can extend to over a kilometre beyond where the trees are planted, and that there is the real risk of those open country species of conservation concern being threatened by well-meaning large-scale tree planting. And at the BTO, we're doing work to try and identify where those sensitive places are and feed those through to the forestry industry and so on to inform decision making. But those same processes equally apply to savanna species in Tanzania or elsewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And working out the on-the-ground policy implications of these things is a challenge and does require work and does require careful thought. And often, that's the bit that is missing. And I guess there just to finish off is a real critical role for organisations like NGOs and so on who deliver that evidence in that space to understand those issues and then to feed that through to governments and decision makers in the right way.
I don't know if Andy's frozen. Can I add one thing, Andy?
Juliet, go for it. If Andy's
So I was just going to also just say, maybe, I mean, I think if we've learned anything from the pandemic, it's, you know, it's one globe and it's all interrelated, and we will have impacts wherever we act elsewhere. And I wonder whether a better way of viewing this might be thinking less about perhaps the specific tree planting, but what we could do by simply protecting the forests we already have. I mean, we would do a lot more for climate and biodiversity by protecting existing tropical forests. And, you know, as a first stage, the best win for us, I would suggest, is that our nature-based solutions are around conserving existing forests where they are now, which capture more carbon and do more for biodiversity than planting, and you know, arguably sustainably managing our own land in terms of agriculture. So I think it's all interconnected.
I'll, if I may, just say something as well. That I think these are big issues, and they're very complex issues, and there's a lot of conflict around some of them because people don't want to do certain things. I'm thinking, you know, governments, landowners, oil companies. There's all sorts of special interests for or against doing some of this stuff. But actually, I think one of the things we need to do as Christians and as churches is to show what can be done and what we as Christians and churches are willing to do. And by that, we learn what's possible and what works and what doesn't, because there'll be, I read a speech by the head of the Environment Agency the other day, and I totally agreed with her, Emma Boyd, going, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Not all of it will work, but we will figure out what works and what doesn't. So this is a whole new area in some ways. Let's get on with what we can do as Christians and churches, with big land that we own, or with our back gardens, with the little churchyard around our church, or with a piece of council land that we're working on with a local community group. Let's get on and do it. You can do it with an eco church if you want, or do it independently, but let's learn what we can do. That then puts us in a better position to say to government and wider society, look, we're doing this. This doesn't work, this does, we're prepared to do the following. Will you also do it with the power and the levers that you've got? I think just shouting at politicians without doing it yourself, much as we may feel like that sometimes, and I certainly do, doesn't have the credibility of doing it yourself, finding out what works, and then asking them to do it at the scale with the levers that they've got. To bring back to James's point, we need this done at scale, but there is nothing preventing us getting on and doing what we can do as Christians and worrying less about what we can't do. And I'm sure God will honor that, and it will have a wider societal influence. Hence, I go back to things like Eco Church or the land goal that we've got, or Climate Sunday. These are things we can do, and they will have an influence if we do them.
Excellent, thank you, Andy. I've switched laptops as well because the reception's gone completely outside, so inside now. A really good question from Lorna on consumption and the church's response to it. I want to broaden that out to a second question about the churches, and firstly to Andy on this, is how, as a group of dedicated and committed Christians in leadership and as church members, can we really start to shift the boundaries on food consumption, on oil and gas and other things, to change our lifestyles? What can we do as a church community to make those changes and to really push our wider community as well as our churches to change? Andy?
I mean, you know, I'm no expert on this, but I mean, here are some ideas. I mean, I think just from observation, I think as Christians and church leaders understand more about how caring for the environment doesn't just help the environment, but actually reinforces the whole mission of the church, caring for the poor, pointing people towards God by observing his beautiful creation, etc. I think we'll get more church leaders on board going, this isn't just a little box I've got to tick. This really helps with everything we need to do. So I think, you know, and I'm starting to see that happen. And a great, you know, I see light bulbs come on for church leaders as they do a little bit of caring for their land in Eco Church. Saw this very recently with a church near here. And as they're doing, in fact, churches count on nature. Andy, the project that you really led up, came by a local, nothing to do with the church, to say, what are you doing here? Because he saw people out doing stuff in the churchyard. Very, very quickly, that person goes, oh, can I help? What are you doing in church? What else are you doing in church? And so on, you know? So I think the church just doing what it can attracts attention, as well as being a witness, and gives them opportunities to talk about people to God, actually, about God. That's just one example of how doing stuff on the environment, we should do it because it's the right thing to do, not because it brings people to church. But I have no doubt at all that actually doing things on the environment visibly and honestly with others in the community will actually bring more people to know God. Simple as that. So let's connect this to the wider mission of the church. That's one thing. Other thing would be, I think, experience suggests that most people get involved in something because they act. Most people aren't terribly cerebral, sit there, figure it all out, and then when they've got the whole solution, go and act. It's the reverse. So I think we round here can all help by inviting a friend or whatever that we know to come and join us in something, take an action. And then people go, oh, that wasn't so bad, that wasn't scary. Actually, I'd like to do that again. So talk to your friends and family, invite them to do something with you on this, and I think you will find the message spreads. That's where we're certainly finding that in Eco Church. And Andy, with the you know, there's been, I was talking to you yesterday, Andy and I had a long call yesterday. There's an explosion in interest in the Partners in Action scheme that Andy and Regina are on the call coordinate. Why is that? I think it's partly because people are seeing the difference it makes and wants to be a part of it. It's a demonstration effect. As one Christian landowner hears about what's going on over there, goes, oh, I want a bit of that. That's great. So, but that's the demonstration effect. So the more that we talk to people and demonstrate what we're doing and involve them in it, don't beat them over the head and make them feel guilty. The reverse, say, come and have some fun, do this with me, see what it's like, it's great. And then I think we'll find more people join us.
Andy, thanks very much. We're shortly coming to the end, and I'm aware we've not got through all the questions, but we'll have a way of reviewing the questions we've not got to, and do our best to answer them and share them with a number of you. But I want to pick up one other thing. A question came in about the complexity of the forms that farmers have to fill in order to do environmental land schemes. Just in the last week, I've been reviewing the new environmental land management scheme that the government will be bringing in to replace the existing programme post-Brexit. And the really good news is, talking to a number of farmers, it looks like it's vastly simpler than what we have had before. And it also will enable farmers to piggyback multiple funding sources for the environment on top of each other, which is fantastic news for everybody. So at the first sight, it looks like farmers will not be buried in red tape. And it's always good, isn't it, at the end of a webinar like this, to take away something really positive, is we have a farming community who are increasingly enthusiastic about what they're seeing. They're about to see new, exciting forms of payment coming in from government that will enable them to do some great things for biodiversity. And, you know, a theme that's run through what Juliet, James, Mike, and Andy have all spoken about today is this concept of hope. And in Habakkuk, it talks about God's ability to do more than we can possibly imagine or believe in. We serve a God who is faithful even in times of environmental crisis. So let's believe in the impossible. And when we see things that give us hope and encouragement, let's really support those initiatives.